Welcome to Our Shakespeare, the channel where I talk about Shakespeare from a 21st century American perspective, and this, my first video in my What the Shakespeare series, where I take a quote or a phrase or a concept from the world of Shakespeare and hopefully explain it in an efficient and easy to understand manner. Today, for the first What the Shakespeare video, the quote, "To be or not to be, that is the question." It's one of the most quoted lines from Shakespeare, but what work does it come from? What does it mean, and what is its context? I'm going to address each of those questions in that order, but first I have to make it very clear that I am only going to be scratching the surface on this quote, because this quote comes from a speech that has been studied and argued over by scholars for centuries. And we could discuss the quote and the speech that it comes from for hours and hours and hours and still have a lot less to say. So, if you feel so inclined, I would encourage you to continue the conversation about this speech in the comments below, and I will be happy to make a contribution to that as well. Question number one, where does this quote come from? Well, the short answer is that it comes from the play Hamlet, which in the United States here in the year 2020 is often regarded as Shakespeare's greatest tragedy. And at the school where I teach, it is taught in English class to 12th graders. The longer answer is that it comes from the second and third publications of this play from Shakespeare's day. The earliest publication of Hamlet actually cites this quote as, "To be or not to be, aye, there's the point." But scholars have generally decided that the second and third publications are a lot better than that first publication. And they're right. So the actual official quote is, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Hamlet was likely written around the year 1600, give or take a year or two. So at the time that this video is recorded, this is a quote that is about 420 years old. Question number two, what does it mean? So Hamlet the character, throughout Hamlet the play, is struggling with what we call existential questions, which is just a fancy way of saying questions related to the meaning of existence. And so what we can do in this quote is we can actually replace the word be with the word exist. And so another way to say it would be to exist or not to exist, that is the question. Or to live or not to live, that is the question. Hamlet is quite literally asking the question whether or not it is worth it to go on living. And so if we take this quote at face value, and we'll talk a little bit more about what face value might mean, but if we take this quote at face value, Hamlet seems to be contemplating suicide. Question number three, what is the context? Well, this line, "To be or not to be, that is the question," comes from the first line of a speech that is about halfway through the play Hamlet. It comes from Act 3, Scene 1. And if you're not familiar with the plays of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's plays are written in 5 acts, so Act 3, Scene 1 is more or less in the middle of the play structurally. And up to this point in the play, Hamlet, the character, is having a really rough time. Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, and his father, the king, has recently died. But his father's ghost comes back and says to Hamlet, "Hey, Hamlet, your uncle, my brother, is the one who killed me." And this uncle, to make matters worse, has gone on to marry Hamlet's mother. And to make matters even worse, the ghost tells Hamlet that he needs to avenge him, therefore killing his uncle. That's pretty rough. That's a lot for anybody to handle. And one way to take the speech, and this is the most common way to take it, is that it is an earnest representation of Hamlet's thoughts in the moment. Hamlet's having a real tough time, so Hamlet's contemplating suicide. That's a very reasonable way to interpret this speech. It's the way most people do it. And most directors of productions of the play will actually place Hamlet on stage by himself, giving this speech directly to the audience, therefore sharing with them his innermost thoughts. But there is another way to interpret this monologue. There may be several other ways to interpret this monologue, but one other that I want to mention that I think is valid. See, way back at the beginning of the play, or closer to the beginning of the play, Act 1, Scene 5, Hamlet says that he is going to put an antic disposition on, which is another way of saying he is going to act crazy as part of his strategy for figuring out what's going on, for figuring out whether his uncle did actually kill his father and whether this ghost that has appeared to him is actually telling the truth. So part of his strategy is to put an antic disposition on and act crazy and make everybody else think that he is crazy. And to add to this, if we look at the stage directions around the monologue that we're talking about, around the speech that we're talking about in Act 3, Scene 1, the stage directions are very vague, leaving open the possibility that either Hamlet is by himself on stage, as it is often staged, but also the possibility that he is not alone on stage, that his girlfriend, Ophelia, is on stage with him. And if that's the case, it leaves open the possibility that these words that he is speaking are not a true representation of his inner thoughts, but are instead intended for Ophelia to overhear as part of his antic disposition, to make her think he is crazy as well, so crazy that he himself would be contemplating suicide. One piece of evidence that supports this interpretation is that Ophelia, later in the play, goes on to commit suicide, leaving open the possibility that she was somehow motivated in part by Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. And speaking of the speech, here is the speech in full. I'm going to go ahead and read this whole speech aloud and put the words up on the screen for you to follow along. If you find you have any questions about what something means, or for clarification about something, or if you just want to tell me that I didn't read it right, by all means, please leave a comment below and I will do my best to respond in a reasonable time frame. So, here it is. The to be or not to be speech from Act 3, Scene 1 of William Shakespeare's Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? The oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia. Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. So there it is. To be or not to be. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe and ring the little bell if you want to be notified every now and then when I make a new video. Thanks for watching. Fare you well. I commend you to your own content.